The first step in assembling your Simon Says circuit board is to break off the little tabs you see right here and here. These were what held it in a larger panel when it was being manufactured. So I just grab it with some pliers here and twist and break them off. You may not have any on your board. It's just kind of the luck of the draw here. And I got one more right up here. Once you have broken those off, then you can take some sandpaper and sand those rough edges that are left behind. So I'm just gonna go back and forth a little bit here. And this part's cosmetic. I mean, it'll affect how much fun it is to play, because you might otherwise rub your finger against it, but it doesn't need to be perfect. Once you think you've done a good job, just run your finger over it real quick to see how smooth it is, just to test it out. The first thing we're going to solder to the circuit board is the diode here. And so I'm going to bend some pretty sharp angles on that diode. Bend the leads so they're 90 degrees there. And I also want to point out that the diode, it's important that you solder the diode in the correct direction. This lines up. You can see that the gray band right on the diode here lines up with this little stripe on the picture of a diode right here. If you put this diode in backwards, your circuit's not going to work. It's actually designed to not work on purpose if you put it in backwards, because this is what protects your circuit from what's called reverse polarity protection. If you put the batteries in wrong, this is what saves you. So we got to put this in correctly so that we're forced to put in our batteries correctly. I'm bending these leads away here just a little bit to make it so that it kind of holds that diode in place. And I'm going to grab the flux pen and put a little tiny bit of flux right where I'm going to add some solder. Once you're done with that, go ahead and snip the leads with your flush cutters. You don't want to cut those perfectly flush. You want them to stick out just a tiny bit from the surface. If you cut them perfectly flush, you might actually cut these little copper pads right off of the board. You don't want to do that. The next step is to solder in the integrated circuit socket. And when you do this, you want to make sure that the notch you see right here on the socket lines up with this notch that you see on the drawing of the socket here. And so I got it lined up. Before I put it in though, I'm going to flip it over and put some flux right where I'm going to solder here. That'll make it a little bit easier. If you really want to, you can put a little flux on these pens too. If you ever find that you're trying to solder something and it's not going well, the first thing to try is to add some flux and see if that helps out. Okay, now that I've put the flux on, I'm going to slide the socket into place, and I'm going to use some tape to hold that socket in place so that it doesn't pull away from the board while I'm soldering. I I like soldering items from in order from items that are closest to the board to items that protrude from the board the most, in that order, because then I can sort of push against the circuit board to help push that item into the circuit board. But even so, it's still a good idea to use tape to hold them into place. Once you've made all of those connections, go ahead and use your flush cutters to cut the leads, so that, again, they're not perfectly flush with the board, but they're pretty close. I recommend doing this face down over a trash can. The only reason I'm not doing that in this demonstration video is so you can see how you're supposed to do the cutting. Otherwise, I always cut face down over a trash can. We have to cut these close to the board because we're going to put a battery on this side of the board, and we don't want these to poke the battery. The next step is to add the switch right up here, so I'm going to flux the back side of that. And maybe the pins on the switch too. And I'm going to use some tape to hold that switch in place. It does not look like it's going to stay on its own. So, here's a little piece of tape, pushing it down on each side. I'm going to take a quick look right here to make sure it's, oh, not even close to what I want. So I'm going to push it in a little bit more and make sure it's flush against the board. Then I'm going to look this way and make sure that those pins look like they're perpendicular to the board, which they look like that's the case. So now I think it's kind of set up the way I want it. And it's time to solder. And get a little bit of solder on the tip of my end and clean it real quick. And then a little bit more on the end, and just feed it right in there. Okay. Once you soldered those, go ahead and clip those ends. And that's not quite close enough. I'm going to go ahead and try and get it a little bit closer. There we go. That's a little better. Alright. The next step is to solder on the LEDs. And the LEDs go right here, here, there, and there. I'm going to put some flux on the back side wherever those LEDs are. Once you're done adding flux, go ahead and start putting the LEDs into place. This is labeled red, so this is going to be the red button, the red LED. You need to make sure that the long lead of the LED goes into the hole with the plus sign. If you don't, your game just won't work. So I've got mine lined up there, and I'm going to push it all the way through. It'll be a little bit hard that last little bit. And then get my green one. Again, making sure to line up the long lead with the positive sign there. Once you have all of your LEDs in place, kind of quickly flip over your board, and then you can push those LEDs into being flush with the board um, just by pushing down on the board. And then you can even bend these leads here just like that, and that'll kind of help to hold those LEDs in place until you get them soldered down. When you're soldering, you still want to push down though to make sure that it's as flush against the board as possible. So you'll see me pushing down with my middle finger while I feed solder into these leads with my index and thumb holding the solder there. Once you're done soldering the LEDs into the back of the board here, it's time to start snipping their leads. Once you finish getting all of the LEDs into place, the next step is to get the buzzer in place. So if you look, the buzzer has a plus sign on it right here. We want to make sure that the plus sign on the buzzer lines up with the plus sign on the board. I also want to put a little flux on the back side of that board so that it's a little bit easier to solder that buzzer into place. And I'm just going to double check and make sure that the plus sign on the back side of the buzzer here matches up with the front side. I'm just going to double check and make sure that that matches up with the buzzer here, which it does. Once you get both of those soldered into place, snip their leads. Now we have just about all of the surface components soldered into place. We could do the buttons next, but the problem with doing the buttons next is we have to reach in between the buttons to solder the battery holders on. So I recommend soldering the middle set of battery holders on before you try soldering on the buttons. And so the middle battery holder on this side, you put it in just like this, and it pays to try and rock it back and forth just a little bit. So I'm going to just rock it a little bit here, and it should kind of snap into position if you're doing it right. Oh, there we go. Make sure you don't stab your finger like I just did. And you want to make sure that this tab right here, it needs to be on the outside edge of the board. So here's the outside edge, of course. Make sure that tab is on the outside. If it's on the inside, you can't slide a battery in there. You'll have a problem. You'll have to undo it, and it'll be very difficult to undo. And let's do the same thing over here. Again, I'm just going to rock this battery holder into place back and forth. There we go. Making sure that the tab is on the outside here, close to the edge of the board. Now that I have those in place, I'm going to push down just a little bit to make sure they're flush against the board. And then I'll put a little flux on them. Now this part I really recommend, and in fact it's more than a recommendation, I command that you make sure that you're not reaching over components when you're soldering on the surface here. You don't want to reach, if you see it like this, you don't want to reach over here, reaching over your LED. You want to make sure that your soldering iron is as far away from all the other components as possible. And so here I got my soldering iron coming from the bottom. I've twisted this board so that there's pretty much no way I can accidentally hit one of those other components. Just keep adding enough solder until it completely covers that entire copper circle. Then I'm going to twist the board around, and again I'm going to set myself up so that I don't have to reach over any components. Next, it's time to put the buttons in. So I'm going to take my flux pen and put a little flux everywhere I'm going to have to solder a button to the board. Once I've put flux on the back side of the board everywhere the buttons are going to go, I'm going to insert the buttons. And unlike the LEDs, I think I'm going to do these one at a time. And I'm going to use a little trick here. That button's not flush against the surface of the reverse side of this circuit board because the LEDs are actually taller than the button. So what I'm doing is I'm going to use this piece of cardboard right here, and I'm going to slide it under just the button so that when I push down on the circuit board, the button is getting pushed flush against the surface of the circuit board. I'm going to push that down with my middle finger, and I'm going to feed solder in with my index and thumb here. Once you've got it, go ahead and clip those leads. And then I'm going to look and make sure that that button is flush against the surface, which it is. Okay. Time for the next button. Once you soldered all of the buttons into place, it's time to add the remaining battery holders. And those are the ones on the outsides here. So I'm just going to insert this one, again rocking it back and forth to get it to snap into place. Once you have all of your battery holders in place, just like that, flip your circuit board over and again push down on it to make sure that those battery holders are being pushed against the circuit board so that they're as flush to the reverse side as possible. Make sure that when you're soldering, again, you don't want to be reaching over any components like this. Always make sure your soldering iron's coming from the outside so that you minimize the chance that you burn one of the pieces that's already soldered to the board. And then just twist your board so that you continue to solder from the outside. Once you're done, your circuit board should look something like this. To make sure that you've trimmed the leads on the back side short enough, we're going to go ahead and add our batteries real quick and then take a look and see if any of those leads come close to touching the batteries. To add the battery, look at the battery symbol and then also notice the plus and the minus sign, and make sure that the battery, there's a knob at the end. You can certainly look at that, and you can also see that the plus sign and the minus sign on the battery match up with the silk screen here. So I'm going to put the battery in, and then I'm going to put the next battery in. And the last one. Now if I turn my Simon Says circuit board sideways, what I'm looking for is to see if any of those leads come close to touching the batteries, and I don't see that's the case. The batteries are separated from the circuit board by a couple millimeters, so it looks like we're going to be safe. Make sure you do a fairly thorough look through here, because you don't want your battery to get poked by any sharp leads.